Hi, how are you? My name is Don Forsyth. I'm a professor at the University of Richmond in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the study of groups. It's true that that's my major area of interest is groups in all their forms and their diversities. I am interested in all kinds of groups, groups that work collectively. Here's some examples. We've got the famous U.S. Airways flight that managed to land in the Hudson without a single loss of life. We've got the Everest climbers. We've got sports teams known for great infractions. We've got great leadership groups such as Kennedy's Executive Committee, and one of my favorite groups, of course, the TOR group. But before we begin our analysis of groups, you have to ask yourself one question. Why? Why study groups? You may have different interests. You may be interested, for example, in leadership or organizational behavior. Groups, how can that help you in your analysis? But to answer that question, let's answer a more basic one. Think for a minute. In your opinion, what is the greatest scientific discovery of the last 100 years? When people consider this, they often think of the physical scientists. Perhaps it was the Einstein's discovery, analysis of the general theory of relativity. Perhaps it was the discovery of not just other solar systems, but galaxies. Hubble's great discovery. Maybe the structure of the DNA. All of those, of course, are marvelous scientific accomplishments. But what about people? What do we know about people now that we didn't know 100 years ago? Although the point's arguable, but many might suggest that it was, yes, Sigmund Freud's work. The discovery and argument that there's a portion of our minds, the unconscious mind, that influences our behavior without our awareness. That insight profoundly changed our understanding of the human being, that we realized that, no, not in all cases we're rational, thoughtful creatures, but in fact in some cases we act on the basis of forces that are unrecognized by us. I would agree with that, but I would suggest that perhaps in the next 100 years a different psychological process might be emphasized. For while Freud in his analysis focused on an internal psychological cause of people's behavior, that perhaps a second cause of people's behavior is more interpersonal, group level processes. So rather than search for something unseen and hidden in the unconscious mind, a group approach suggests to, in fact, look at something we see every day, the groups that surround us. So why should we study groups? Well, the answer is obvious, because groups hold the secret to the universe. Groups matter a great deal. They're practically significant. Much of the world's work is done by people not in isolation, but in groups. They're personally significant. You will spend your entire life in groups, unless you're a castaway or a complete recluse. But most of us live our lives trying to get into and trying to escape from groups. Groups inform any intellectual analysis of human behavior, whether it be psychological, sociological, historical, and of course culturally. It's very difficult to understand individuals or collections of individuals across the world unless we understand group level processes. Just to reiterate that point, let's think for just a moment about groups and what they do. They invent nearly everything, including the technology I'm using to present this material to you. It wasn't a single individual, Bill Gates, for example, or Steve Jobs, that created the personal computer. It was a team at the Palo Alto Research Center. They discover everything, although very frequently when we think about, the scaling of Mount Everest by Hillary, or Marco Polo opening the East to trade. In fact, it was groups of individuals who made this possible, not single individuals. Most of the things that exist in the world these days that are created by people are created by groups of people rather than single individuals. Very rare is the isolated craftsman who makes something from start to finish. Now products are assembled by teams, and much of the work is done by the world in the world these days in groups. From surgical teams, we often think that the surgeon alone works to heal the sick, but that's very unlikely. Much of the world's work is done by groups. Of course, groups are also responsible for much of the mischief that takes place in the world. Conflict between groups. The famous Hatfield and McCoy rivalry is pictured in here, this example. And this is a tragic image of the Jonestown mass suicide. But they also create the great beauty in the world. So bands, orchestras, dance troupes, artist circles, writers clubs, improvs, flash crowds perhaps is the newest example of groups creating interesting artistic phenomena. And they also make many of the decisions that take place in the world if an important decision must be made, a difficult choice, which may yield very negative consequences if the wrong choice is made. It's very rare that a single individual will make that choice. Generally, that responsibility is shared by a group of people. So yes, they discover, invent, make everything. They do the work, make the mischief, make the good. And for those of us who are interested particularly in leadership, that's where they are the context where most leadership occurs. Although we're naturally drift to the idea that great leaders, say a president of the United States, is alone and isolated. In fact, most leadership takes place in small groups rather than in isolation. So although we've many times spoken of the great man theory of leadership, suggesting that history is shaped by single individuals of great authority and prominence, our perspective, focusing on groups, suggests that great groups theory is more apt. That even the most powerful leader of the free world, President Obama, rarely conducts his work alone, but instead is, in most cases, enmeshed in a group context. So obviously groups are extremely important for understanding ourselves and for others. So what do we need to know about groups? Where should our analysis begin? Well, we'll start with a foundation where we'll talk about what a group is, how we define a group, and try to understand its basic characteristics and how people have done research on them. What to ask next are perhaps some of the foundational features. How do groups come into existence, and how do they change over time? We'll ask questions about what is the relationship between the individual within the group and the group itself. Why do people join groups? Why do they leave groups? How do they feel when they're excluded from groups? And we'll also have to deal with the basic question of group cohesion. How does a group become unified over time, and why does it sometimes splinter? And then lastly, structure of a group. How are roles and norms and inter-member relationships formed in a group, and how do they influence the group's actions over time? Perhaps the heart of the analysis of group dynamics has to do with the interaction between people. Why does some people in groups influence others a great deal, and others are able to resist that influence? What determines when a person will become influential in a group, and who will not be influential? And of course, the type of influence we're most interested in is leadership. Why is it that in a group, some individuals are willing to relinquish their own autonomy and allow someone else within the group to make decisions for them, and then act in ways to carry out those decisions? It's a fascinating phenomenon, I think. Groups are the workhorses of the world. Much of the world's work is done in groups, so groups work together collectively to achieve tasks. They make most of the decisions in the groups, and oftentimes they work collaboratively in extremely cohesive, highly structured groups, which are known these days as teams. Time allowing, we'll deal with some other topics related to groups that are very fascinating. We'll deal with conflict within the group, conflict between groups as well. In general, conflict is in its most intense when it involves two groups rather than two individuals. Groups also exist in a particular place, an environment. So if we wish to understand groups, we have to know where they exist in the world. Much of the many approaches to psychotherapeutic change are done at the individual level, but more recently there's been a focus on using groups to achieve that change, so we'll discuss that. And although most of our focus in this particular analysis is on smaller groups, say groups between ranging in size from 2 individuals up to 20 or 40, 30 or 40, that some groups become quite large and their dynamics are a bit different. And so we'll also, time allowing, discuss these large groups, crowds and mobs and other forms of collective behaviors. So our first topic in our first chapter of analysis is we'll discuss the nature of groups, and we'll also spend a little time discussing the nature of group dynamics, which is, of course, the scientific study of the nature of groups. Well, welcome to the study of groups, and we'll end with a quick view of an example of one of the kinds of groups that fascinates me, the Tor group. Groups, you just gotta love them, don't you?